tonight deals with the concept of union through knowledge. And in this department, we must first clarify some general misconceptions concerning the substance of knowledge. If you look in the dictionary, you will find that knowledge means fact acquired through experience. Now that is rather different from what we generally understand the word to mean. Thus, knowledge is not derived from books, from the daily newspaper, your favorite commentator, or your public school. Because knowledge has to have the dimension of experience. The dictionary says so. And I rather like that particular point. Apparently, many folks have forgotten the essential meanings of words. Knowledge, then, cannot truly be said to exist apart from certain participation in what we term facts. And this participation means the inclusion of a dimension of internal activity. Therefore, unless things studied, read, and learned are brought to light by some power or energy within the person himself, the state of knowledge is not acquired. Now this in itself opens an interesting field of speculation. But we cannot pause here. We must now begin to study, if we can, the fact of knowledge. What is knowledge, essentially? What are these facts that must be experienced? And in what way do they contribute to the spiritual growth and integrity of the human being? There are two kinds of knowledge, so-called. One kind of knowledge results from man's impact with his environment and the resulting inflowing of the testimonies of the sensory perceptions. There is another kind of knowledge which comes from within the person and usually must be experienced through application. Thus, there are two kinds of experience. Man's inward experience of external phenomena and man's power to externalize through experience the internal facts of his life. Thus, inner facts must be outwardly applied. Outward facts must be inwardly applied in order to complete the essential pattern of knowledge. Now, there are things which we believe that we know because we hold them firmly as conviction within consciousness. Yet these things, to be truly known, must be brought from within the life and applied to the phenomena of living. This is why so many theories, which are impractical but often delightful, continue to dominate the conduct of human beings, leading them into an illusion. Unless these inward realities are justified through application, we do not have the state of knowledge. On the other hand, unless those things which we see, the experiences which occur to us, the reports which come to our attention, the accumulated traditional heritage of learning, which is bestowed upon us, unless all of these are taken into ourselves and subjected to an alchemical transmutation within consciousness, they do not lead to a true state of knowing. Knowing, therefore, implies activity. Knowing without action can never fulfill itself. A thing known must be performed, must be done. A conviction held on the level of knowing must be applied. A code which we know to be right must be lived. The failure to transform these abstractions into practice deprives us of the experiential dimension of knowing. And this experiential part is the part which proves or disproves things held to be true. If in action, if in application, principles fail to operate, then we must assume that we are in error concerning the things which we believe. A man holding a certain attitude toward life, if he finds this attitude is not productive to better living, should reflect, and in all probability find that he has erroneously interpreted ideas which may in themselves be sound, but which he has misunderstood. Knowing, therefore, most of all implies a laboratory procedure, a process of trying all things and clinging unto that which is good. And that which is outward knowledge must be applied to our inward convictions, to the patterns of motivation within us. If the things which happen to us do not enrich our inner living, we have failed to accept them. And instead of knowledge, we have ended in opinion, prejudice, conceit, fantasy. Actually, if we wish to take an empirical position, which is present strongly in Eastern philosophy, any experience of any kind which does not advance our internal life has been misunderstood by us. Even though that experience may be tragic, may be disastrous, may be apparently unhappy in all of its parts, it has failed to fulfill its purpose if it has not contributed to our understanding of essential good. Now, this might appear to come very close to a platitudinous viewpoint. But either this statement is empirically true, or else the universe is meaningless. Either disasters have purpose, or they do not. If they have purpose in a universe ruled by good, that purpose must be good. And the end of all tragedy must be the support and enrichment of good. Thus, if our external occurrences have not enriched us, we are deficient in essential knowledge. If our internal attainments have not induced us to enrich our world and to profit others and to live well, then again, we have not justified the requirements of the principle of knowledge. The next thing to consider, then, is that knowledge, per se, or in substance, in essence, in fact, implies two situations or conditions. One is the thing knowing, and the other is the thing known. Knowledge implies a knower. And knowledge consists of the enrichment of that knower, or the communication of fact to that knower. Thus, we have a twofold relation in life, which we like to term subject-object relationship. In our view of living, the knower is the subject. Knowledge is the object. The object of life, we feel, is to grow. To grow implies increase not only of form, but of knowing. Thus, in Western thinking, the knower is an accumulator. He is an existing being, a principle, a fact, a spiritual living substance, a self, capable of possessing knowledge, capable of accumulating knowledge, capable of remembering knowledge, and achieving a kind of growth through the enlargement of knowledge, so that we regard a person whose knowledge is greater as a person of larger stature and attainment. We consider, therefore, to apply the term wise to the individual is to signify attainments, and that such a person has the internal ornamentation of superior wisdom or learning. The subject-object relation is the cause of a considerable amount of philosophic debate. It brings many correlatives into action. Upon it other things depend, and it in turn depends upon interpretations of basic principles. So we assume for the moment, but we're not going to leave it there, but we will assume for the moment that each of us is a knower, and that each of us desires to know. The reason for this desire may differ with each individual. Some wish to know because they desire to be better. Some wish to know because they believe it gives them an advantage over others. Some seek knowledge in order to advance their material fortunes. Others to advance their inner living. But as the old adage says, knowledge is power. And it is assumed that the knower has certain advantages over an ignorant person. Advantages relating not only to his own security as an individual, but to his sphere of influence in world affairs and over the lives of other persons. Subject-object, therefore, can be extended into many spheres of activity, but always subject-object on the level of knowledge implies that there exists a being capable of knowing, and that there exists a world of phenomena capable of being known. Now, we all assume this and live without even attempting to define such a concept. We accept it. It is familiar to us all, rather through circumstances than through a formalization in terms of thought or philosophy. Now, this brings us into direct contact with the problem of the knower. Now, just what kind of a being is this that has within it the power to know? Is this a spiritual entity deposited somewhere in the mysterious vastnesses of the composite human being? Is this knower something that is individual, personal? Is each knower a separate entity? Must each knower, therefore, conquer for himself the mystery of things to be known? Is each individual growing alone? Is his struggle from beginning to end his own private battle against unknowing and toward the achievement of the state of complete knowing? If there is a knower within us, what is the substance of that knower? Is it mental? Is the mind the knower? We have come almost to consider the mind and the self as identical. And in a strange way, many of our Eastern brothers would agree with that, but not quite in the way that we would intend them to. Mind has within it what appears to be the center of intellection in the human composition. And it is believed that if consciousness has an inner vestment, a subtle body peculiarly suitable to its needs and responsive to its impulses, that this is the mind. Because we cannot conceive of a state of knowing apart from the mind and its physical instrument, the brain. We conceive knowing to arise largely from the impact of sensory perception upon the brain and its transference in or through the brain to some center of intellection. To the materialist, this center of intellection is a psychochemical process or structure within the brain itself. To the idealist, it is a separate entity, a being apart from brain and inhabiting it as a man might inhabit his house. But we do face one important consideration, that as far as human beings are concerned, man has no experience of knowledge apart from what he commonly terms the brain-mind formula or pattern. Thus he naturally and instinctively assumes that the mind is the source of his power to know, and that whatever may be the deeper implications of his consciousness, these deeper parts must depend upon the mind for testimony, and that the mind is their instrument, their peculiarly sensitized area by which they may receive phenomena, and also through which they may from within create patterns which may gradually be objectified through the mind and brain into the exterior life of the person. Thus the mind is a sort of two-way road leading both in and out, and along this road must travel those impulses which relate to internal or external knowledge. Now, is this a reasonable conclusion? Is this the true answer to the problem? What is the relation of mind to knowledge? And we come to a very basic formula, and we have evidence around us to sustain this concept. And it is to the effect that in some mysterious way, what we call the mind is insufficient for the essential purpose which we assume it was created to attain. The one thing that mind cannot give us is truth. This has been a perturbing situation from the beginning. The ordinary products of the mind we can see around us in what might be termed endless confusion. There is nothing in the world more common than mental conflict. Yet if mind has within it the power of the actual and factual possession of knowledge, then there should be an inevitable motion throughout all life, intelligent life, towards identity. If the mind had the power of rapid and immediate perception of realities, we could have very few differences, because we cannot assume that the inevitable diversity of opinion represents a diversity of fact. It cannot. In the religious world, for example, we have within the field of Christendom nearly 500 sects, each one of which feels that it possesses a peculiar authority, that its own interpretation is peculiarly correct. Now, something is obviously lacking, and the thing that is lacking must be the truth itself. Because if these possessed a truth, they would possess this in common. And about that which is known, there cannot be opinion. But about that which is unknown, there cannot be certainty. We live in a world which indicates that up to the present time at least, the intellectual equipment of man is incapable of bestowing certainty. If there was certainty, we would not have war. We would not have the endless divergence of opinion among the learned, the schooled, and the skilled. We might still suffer from the opinions of those without knowledge. But we would not find that those who increase in knowledge can still retain highly separate, highly antagonistic attitudes on the same subject. Thus, we must come to the conclusion that either the mind is incapable of the final experience of a reality, or else at this time in human evolution, the human being is not sufficiently advanced to make possible a common experience of mind. And therefore, by either definition, the mind is not immediately available for the solution of the basic problems of life. If the mind is not available, are we to assume, therefore, that these problems are unsolvable and must remain so until some future time, some infinite time to come, in which evolution, growth, unfoldment, education, or culture will so enrich man's inner faculties that he may possess this power of common agreement? There is a tendency, but a very slow and gradual one, for agreement to arise. And the evolution of man does indicate that on certain matters he is gradually attaining a more holistic perspective. But as yet, this is far from being sufficient to his needs. Now in the West, emphasizing the Noah, we enter into an incredible cycle of individuation. We then conceive the human race to be composed of an infinite number of separate beings, each of whom must depend fundamentally and basically upon its own knowing power for its security in every department of living. We have learned that collective security does not result in individual security. We have learned that it is perfectly possible to be miserable in a prosperous and apparently harmonious environment. We find that the individual, regardless of his condition or his state, cannot escape the limitations imposed by his own character and disposition. If, therefore, this process of ultra-individualism continues to be the basis of a philosophy of life, the individual emerges indeed as a rugged, or more likely a ragged individual, one in whom the struggle for sufficiency must go on indefinitely. Now comes a further consideration. Assuming that this struggle does go on, assuming that in the infinite futurity of things, all these selves, all these knowers, will achieve to a state of sufficiency so that they can become completely self-secure units, what do we then have? Some will say the Golden Age. But we will have arrived at one of the most mysterious and disagreeable concepts conceivable to us if we think it through, and that is we would arrive at absolute static. Every individual sufficient for himself, sitting on his own doorstep, having answered all questions and solved all mysteries, and therefore probably having achieved in this process actual physical immortality, would sit there forever. Because he would then have no further to go. He would have achieved the fullness of his own capacity. And he would still be a person, with all the limitations of a person, unless there is some dimension that goes beyond his present thinking. So here we pause and come back again to the immediate situation. Object-subject. The subject man, the object knowing, or knowledge. And the next consideration which arises from this. If knowledge is legitimate, what is its purpose? Have we conceived even for a moment the essential nature of the purpose of attaining a state of knowledge? We cannot assume, for example, that any definition which relates purely and simply to our material concerns can be sufficient. After all, does it make any great difference on the level of materialism whether a man dies a sage or an imbecile? What is the difference? He is just as dead in either case. Therefore, on a material level, his intelligence is valuable only as a community asset. It is valuable only to others and not to himself. Because wise or foolish, learned or unlettered, he must go down to the dust with all his kind. If we are not material, and assume that there is a survival of consciousness beyond the mortal state in which we live, then the dimensions of knowledge open a little, but we are cursed with a new dilemma. If such is the case, and we are the citizens of a larger universe, and this is merely an interlude in our existence, then of what value is what we learn here when we leave here? Supposing we have mastered the intricacies of chemical gardening, are we going to assume that in the Elysian fields we will have any need for it? Supposing we have actually become the outstanding banker in our community, what will we do on the banks of the other shore? Suppose we have learned with great care and difficulty how to split an atom. Where will we use that knowledge? And the whole concept of knowledge, as we know it here, is limited entirely to a state in which our normal lifespan is 70 or 80 years. Now there are some, and this includes both Easterners and Westerners, who like to contemplate the doctrine of rebirth, who like to feel that there is a continuity of life not only in space but in this world, and that the individual may well use knowledge gained here at some future time. He may come back here. But assuming the present rate of progress, and assuming the philosophically accepted interval between embodiments, supposing we had died in the age of Charlemagne and had been born today, what would the knowledge and skill we had then do for us? If George Washington came back here today after an interval of only less than 200 years, what would his attainments in most departments mean to him? Assuming that which is obvious, namely that most of the things that we do today will be obsolete within a century, that most of our most boasted discoveries will be reversed in 200 years, or will be so far advanced by that time that our knowledge concerning them today would seem little more than infantile, here again, it looks like we're wasting a great deal of time. Because if we do not do something to housing, banking, and related matters within the next couple of 1,000 years, by which our present standards are obsolete, we will have made very little of progress in some very important fields. So we cannot assume that the knowledge of particulars, here again through the processes of training, will be too valuable to us. And experience also seems to indicate that these very forms of knowledge must be relearned in any event upon embodiment, because we have very few instances known, if any, in which a court stenographer of the Roman Empire was born with a shorthand book in his hand or with any greater facility to learn the subject than he had. So here again the problem rests. But the philosopher might go a little further. He might be hitting a little closer to the truth. He might say, yes, that is true of banking and stenography. It is true of chemistry and art and literature and music. But is it true of morality? Does the ethical standard of man survive? Is honesty going to be any different 2,000 years from now? Is integrity going to be any different? It may be applied in different ways, but is the principle of the power of the individual to weigh all things and cling unto that which is good, does that change? Is there any real difference between Greek or Roman honesty and American honesty? Is there any difference between Hindu idealism of the days of the Vedas and modern idealism? Have these changing times anything to do about man's internal capacity to adjust and therefore to survive? Let's accept that for a moment and think about it. Let us grant it. Let us grant that there may be a kind of ethical knowledge, a kind of knowledge resulting from the enrichment of character, from the enlargement of understanding, from the generosity of spirit. There's that kind of knowledge might have a survival value. It might have a survival value here. And it might have a survival value somewhere else in case man has an immortality apart from here. Assuming man's survival as a conscious being, the only things that can be valuable to him in a different state are principles within his own consciousness, which must be applicable to any state in which a reasonable creature can exist. That's a delightful thought. Then why does it happen that in the 80 or 70 years we live here, we receive every kind of knowledge except that kind of knowledge? And that every effort is made to make us into good bankers and brokers, but it is only by a desperate effort of our own, accompanied by privation and reverse, that we are able to attain to the kind of knowledge that might have a survival significance. Why are these surviving possibilities ignored almost completely throughout our educational system, except in certain sectarian departments? Knowledge, then, must be considered as of two kinds. That by which we can live well here, and that by which we might hope to live well forever. And that knowledge by which we might live well forever anywhere must, on the level of philosophy, have precedence over that which is only useful under certain conditions and at certain times. And there are probably persons here who have been forced in midstream to change their ways of life because the arts, crafts, trades, or sciences with which they were acquainted in their youth and for which they prepared themselves have no longer any vitality. It's like a friend of mine who spent the second half of his life moaning over the fact that he was probably the best buggy whip manufacturer in the country. All he is, nobody wanted any buggy whips. So it has been a matter of often readapting education to the changes within a lifetime, let alone within the great changes of history. But we begin to see a residue of knowledge here that seems to have a permanent significance. And this knowledge goes deeper and deeper into ourselves and relates primarily to these great principles, which must have validity wherever beings with a consciousness such as our own have an existence. If this consciousness does not exist, or does not survive, then there is no validity to any point in this argument. But if it does survive, and does have an existence, and the individual continues, there is one thing reasonably evident, that if he exists at all, he must get along with himself. We do not know who else he may have to get along with, but if he survives, he must get along with himself. And up to now, that has been one of the most difficult programs that the human being has been faced by, because everything that we learn teaches us to get along with someone else. Not that we do that very well in most cases. That is where the training is emphasized. The object-subject problem carries us a little further. Subject, as Noah, must confront a tremendous mystery, and must sometimes contemplate the incredible panorama of that which must be known. We think that some humans are rather smart, but actually in the presence of the unknown, we are all fools together. With all the attainments that we have made, we have not even lifted the fringe of the unknown. And as we proceed further, we come nearer and nearer to bewilderment, because the vastness of the universal plan is simply beyond our comprehension as beings. Even if we continued for countless aeons of constant and industrious discovery, we would still be faced by the unknown. And we would come nearer and nearer to the realization that there is a mysterious dark wall that divides the known from the unknown. And any subject on the level of the objective, which we follow long enough and trace carefully enough, goes slowly towards this dark wall and disappears. The noumenal side of existence, the source of things, the causes for things, and the reasons for things, are never immediately available to us. We may observe manifestations, but the nature of the manifesting power is eternally elusive. We have no ability. We can divide matter until matter disappears. And yet when it has disappeared, nothing has been lost except our ability to find it. So we are constantly in the presence of effects, which as we trace them to their causes, seem to disappear and leave not a rack behind. Yet these causes and these causes alone are solutional in the level of knowledge. For without the knowledge of cause, all men are ignorant. Now then, can the knower know cause? That's a very large question. And upon that, we must pause for a moment to consider the relation of the knower to cause. Assuming cause as a supreme fact, and assuming cause to possess within itself the potential of all effect, we must come to the conclusion that if there is anything in the universe that knows all, that thing must be totality itself. Nothing else can. No part can ever know all. Therefore, if there is an all-knowing resident in existence anywhere, that all-knowing reposes in the all-being. And from that all-knowing and that all-being must proceed those things which can be known. and which in themselves possess quality and dimension. If, therefore, there is a plan, and this creation is the unfoldment of that plan, then the only power or being possessing the full and complete knowledge of the plan is the planner itself. The parts can never know, because no part can ever know more than itself. Because the moment it retires to the source of its own existence and becomes identical with self-knowledge, it has reached the termination of its own identity. So all-knowing must depend upon all-knower. And an all-knower must be totality. Must have within itself the capacity of complete existence. And that this complete existence may be regarded as knowing or unknowing is a tremendous question. Is this complete existence to be defined as the all-conscious? Or is it to be defined as the unconscious? In other words, does the root of existence so completely transcend knowing that totality is superior to knowing? Therefore, has an existence apart from knowing, and consequently, whatever its state may be, it is remote even from knowing. Man creates the term unconscious to describe the root of his own or the collective consciousness. But whether he is using this term to mean that which is unconscious or that of which he is unconscious is another large question. Like the small boy who took the attitude, I don't see it, therefore it isn't. Is this term really indicative of anything known, or is it merely indicative of our own desperate effort to define an abstraction? Now, if we assume a totality at the root of existence, and follow certain Eastern systems of thinking, we are going to come to the conclusion that totality is superior to knowing. Therefore, that knowing is a dependency upon totality. And for that reason, knowing can never know totality, because it is inferior to it, or posterior to it in concatenated descent. There was an ancient Babylonian formula, Chaldean also, which says that each thing may be known by that which is anterior to itself, but cannot be known by that which is posterior to itself. In other words, a larger may know all of its parts, but no part may know all of the larger part of which it is a part. Therefore, superior natures may know inferiors, but inferiors may not know superiors. And we use knowing now in the sense of fact by experience, or by actual identification. Thus, the possibility that man is not so foolish as he sounds when he says, my house, my hands, my eyes, my body, my mind. That mind is a possession. Mind is something like a body, but is not to be considered as identical with that which possesses, or that which defines, or that which claims proprietorship through anterior order, or through superior state. So assuming for thus the moment, as we seem to have to assume in Eastern philosophy, that totality alone can be all awareness. And also assuming or accepting that which we must accept, namely that we are not going to arrive at a valid definition of totality, because we are not going to be the little fish that could swallow the ocean. We cannot understand that which is infinitely beyond us. Therefore, we are not going to define totality. We are merely going to reason about it. Perfectly aware, as Buddha pointed out, that our reasoning probably will be higher foolishness. But at the same time, may contribute something to a perspective. This totality, if it be, and if it be the cause of a universe manifesting infinite wisdom, infinite law, infinite life, infinite mind, infinite love, and infinite diversity of harmonic form and proportion, from all that is knowable, from all that is visible, from all that is tangible and to be experienced by man, we derive the grand concept of a universe which is manifesting a supreme skill, a supreme artistry, a supreme sufficiency in the forces by which it was fashioned, by which it is maintained, and by which it unfolds through infinity. Thus, while we cannot define the nature of this infinite, we can become negatively conscious that some of its attributes are in themselves so sublime, so completely sufficient, so transcendent in the manifestations of their power, their integrity, and their validity, that we cannot but assume that the source of these things must in itself be a summation of the known and the unknown in terms of an infinite splendor. Thus, by negative approach, we come to the conclusion that totality is deficient in nothing. That is, to use the Pythagorean term, that it is superabundant in all things. That it is the eternal fountain from which flows everything conceivable. And all of these outpourings, themselves orderly, complete, systematic, sufficient, glorious, beautiful, and good. If this be true, which our limited perspective seems to imply, then we can apperceive but dimly, but still we can sense the infinite, limitless power at the root of existence, and have certain confidence, certain assurance that the cause is no less than its effect, and that as we see but part of the effect and are overwhelmed thereby, that the totality must be inconceivable. Now, with this situation rather firmly set in our minds, the knower discovers that it may possess knowledge of things less than itself, but it cannot possess knowledge of that which is greater than itself. It can orient its own place in a pattern of parts, but it cannot experience the wholeness of these parts, because it is not all of them. Therefore, as it exists in part, therefore it must think in part, reason in part, hope in part and believe in part. This means, as the Chaldeans so wonderfully explained it, that man may possess in periods, but that forever and eternally superiors possess him. And this is an interesting consideration. The dog may own his own fleas, but the man owns the dog, and the dog will never own his master. Therefore, in medicine, the human being may own his house, and try to own his relatives. He may attempt to own his business, but he can never own his world. And this is true both of his inner world and his outer world. And those who have tried to conquer the world have found to their grief that the only thing that man who wants the earth will ever get will be the 6 feet of it that fall in his grave. Now, if we think in these terms, let's see what this implies. Let's think through this thought for a moment. A man may know that which is inferior to himself, but must only be known by that which is superior to himself. This becomes his relationship between God and nature, between which man stands, as Goethe says, twixt heaven and earth, dominion weakly. Man may unfold the pageantry of his socialized existence on a material plane. But as he turns inward, he turns towards superior. And his relationship with his own origin is always a negative relationship. Whereas his relationship to the things over which he has authority is a positive relationship. Now, in our Eastern thinking, for a moment, we work with this thought considerably. That man may possess knowledge, but he must be possessed by truth. That he cannot possess it because it is greater than he is. And the individual can no more possess that which is greater than he is than he can eat a meal which is larger than his own body. He must, therefore, in his relationship to superiors and inferiors, recognize that his approach to superiors is through the gradual development of receptive powers, whereas his relation to exteriors is justified and maintained through the gradual development of objective, aggressive powers. Man can never be aggressive toward the infinite. He can never take the kingdom of heaven by storm. He can never force himself into a superior state of being. Nor can he force his own entity above a level on which such entities have their natural existence. So subject-object relationship is subject to a sudden twist. And the individual who says, I am the subject and life is the object, is referring downward into objectivity. When he turns back and refers upward into subjectivity, he says, I am the object and it is the subject. In other words, the knower, subjectively, is not himself, because he is one of the things that the knower can know, but he can never know the knower. Thus his relationship is turned, and instead of being positive to an environment that is negative, he suddenly finds that he is negative to an environment that is positive. His spiritual salvation, therefore, depends upon the fact that he is known not the fact that he knows. This is the root of mysticism. Because mysticism is man entering into a receptive relationship to superiors. Now, we do not mean by receptive negative. We do not mean that the individual gradually becomes a non-entity. But we do mean a disciplined receptivity. Now, a disciplined receptivity depends on something, and here's where your disciplines in this yoga become important. You've all known people who were being forever moved by some quaint impulses from within themselves. These impulses have led them from one infirmity to another. They have also perhaps developed spiritistic tendencies and are being controlled by anything from a pendulum to a Ouija board. These individuals are receptive enough to please anyone, but they are not receptive in the philosophical sense of the word. They are just plain negative. They have chosen to permit themselves to become a vacuum, and as a result have gradually accumulated the trash that was floating around in space. This does not mean the things that we intend to imply. The individual passing along his way of life moves from one level to another. It would be inconceivable that a child who is 2 years old could enter into a state of divine expectancy, close his eyes, and become 18 years old. We would be very, very much upset if anything like that occurred. Because before he can be 18, he must be 17, 16, 15, 14, and so on, year by year. Before internally he can gradually ascend to a condition superior to his present state, he must fulfill his present state, and not avoid it, or evade it, or believe that he can. He does not, therefore, fulfill the requirements of a disciplined existence by reverting to a primitive state. We might almost say that there is here the difference between childishness and childlikeness, which is a great difference. Small people are childish. Great sages are often childlike in their simplicity, their humility, their gentleness. The tremendous development of faith and beauty in them. They have certainly moved from a most unsophisticated condition through a sophisticated world and have restored their own unsophisticated internal. They have grown through confusion back again into integration. And in integration, they have found peace, security, and a childlike faith in the reality of things. They have passed from not knowing through partial knowing to a kind of knowing, which does not imply any degree of sophistry, such as we know in education or culture today. So that the disciplines involved are that the individual shall grow, shall form out of his objective life the pedestal for his subjective life. And that for him, while he is in this world, or while he is part of this cycle of existences, cannot safely proceed to the most sacred laws and practices until he has fulfilled. He must fulfill the law and the prophets and not destroy them. But it does so in a manner that leaves no weakness or insecurity, and also by discipline relieves the human being of one intensely dangerous reflex, and that is fantasy. Until fantasy is conquered, every spiritual discipline of man is a danger to him. Inasmuch as fantasy can and usually is mistaken for an advanced state of knowing. Fantasy exists as long as the various departments of man's personality are undeveloped. As long as the human being is selfish, he can fall into fantasy and does. As long as he is egocentric, he is suffering not only from hallucination, but the danger of many errors and many phantoms arising in his experience. While he is capable of anger, he is capable of error. The moment the individual finds that he has reached the extremity of his own temperance, he has reached the circumference of his own safety. That is terribly important. Man living from within himself and planning and preparing for a superior kind of existence reminds me a little bit of the writings of the French transcendentalist Elvis Levy. This priest, who took the Kabbalistic name of Levy, said that the astral light, which is so important in certain mystical things, is a beautiful garden of wonderful flowers, each one with a poisonous serpent twisted around the stem. This is the fool's paradise, and the only paradise the fool can ever inhabit. It is the paradise of wishing. It is the paradise of mystery and imagining. It is the paradise of fantasy. It is where the individual finds it possible to validate anything he hopes for, wishes for, or believes in. But every wish, every hope turns upon him, and he discovers that its beauty conceals a poison. So, the development of consciousness requires and demands discipline. And the purpose of Jnana Yoga is to achieve this integrity and security in relation to knowing. It is the individual coming finally to the experience that his own belief that he knows is the great illusion which he faces. And that as long as that illusion remains, he is insecure. And that as long as he believes that with his own egocentric, polarized entity, he is capable of the ultimate attainment of knowledge, he is also going to fall under the fantasy that he today and at this hour knows more than he does. That everything that we do is moved largely from opinion, and that opinion is the falsest form of foundation. That before then he can go on to the disciplines which may lead to the higher phases of his subject. He must free himself from the illusion of false knowledge, and the illusion that knowledge can be possessed by him. This is a long road, and what we call learning is the gradual discovery that we do not know. Now, in line with the thought that we had last week, friends have suggested that about this time in the talk, we give everybody a 5-minute stretch. How many folks would think that's a good idea? All right, let's have a 5-minute stretch and then go on. between this and certain positive expressions which we want to consider. Now, we've already mentioned this problem of the divided self. The self in each person struggling desperately to know what is in everyone else and ending by not even knowing what's in himself. This is the patent dilemma. Well, it occurs to those who are a little bit thoughtful, perhaps, that assuming that we should find out all there is to know about ourselves, we would still be in a poverty-stricken state unless this also gave us a dimension of extending consciousness to something outside of ourselves. It really makes very little difference what we do with the prison as long as we stay in it and the door is still locked. We may allow it to remain a hovel, or we may make a palace out of it. But we are still captives. We are still held within the most dangerous pattern in the world, and that is utter isolation. The only possible solution, then, to the significance of consciousness, even for the average person, is that through it he can experience something beyond himself. Now, to experience something beyond himself, he has to assume that his consciousness extends beyond himself. And he attempts to approach this problem on the level of parapsychology or on such experiments as telepathy and things of that nature, by means of which it seems possible that he may experience something beyond himself. But study your records in your parapsychology work, and you will find that it is perfectly possible by telepathy to exchange the spots on a dice or the figures on a deck of cards. But there have been no reports by parapsychology of an individual actually experiencing the consciousness of anything else. So that hasn't proved the answer. And it probably will remain a blind alley. Because we're still dealing only with a magnetic field and the possibility of mental transference of image, which is not unknown and has been practiced for thousands of years. But there again, this does not unlock the door to man's unification as a conscious experience of being. Now, if we wish to assume for the moment a Platonic position, and to begin with the concept of totality, and to recognize that totality represents one knowing power, and infinitely diversified but undivided, we may begin to get nearer to something. There is the old description that comes in both Eastern and Western literature of the man who put his fingers through the holes in the curtain. And the man on the outside said, "I see 5 fingers," but the man behind said, "I see 1 hand." And that is one of the problems. We see on the outside, on the phenomenal side, separate parts that we are beginning to apperceive as a rational necessity. That these parts are the members of one thing larger than the totality of themselves and including all these parts. In your Eastern concept of yoga, therefore, selves, conscious entities, are recognizable as parts of a totality greater than themselves. And here's another important thing. The fact that the individual looks at himself does not mean that he experiences himself. Therefore, the individual may say, "I am a spiritual being. I am eternal. I am immortal. I am part of something greater than myself." But still, because of the position which he takes in actually making these statements, he cannot experience the thing he states. He's blocked by the fact that these are the phenomenal observations of his own unit of intelligence. Consequently, he is not experiencing these things. He is merely affirming them intellectually. He can say, "I am part of God," but that does not convey to him the experience of God. Nor does it convey to him the actual proof of the statement that he himself has made. It is an affirmation, not a realization. not an inner experience of being. Beginning, consequently, with the concept of totality and moving downward, we come to the basic problem of what constitutes the essential nature of totality. And here, as I have said, we are merely using words. We do not know whereof we speak. But we have certain internal apperception of some phase, some fringe of what we mean. There is something there, whether we're able to integrate it in our own idea or not. And the thing that we intuitively or inspirationally know or believe with great conviction and intensity is that this totality consists of the absolute unity, not only of things visible, but of principles invisible, of energies, of qualities, of emotions, of thoughts, of ideals, of dreams, of aspirations, of every conceivable and inconceivable function of this mysterious and elusive thing called consciousness. Therefore, essentially, this totality represents more than what we would term cosmic consciousness, more than what we would call the infinite or the absolute in our religious, theological understanding of such terms, more than the term God as we use it in a sectarian way. It represents something which transcends even the concept of being as creature or as a separate and recognizable entity. It is no longer God sitting up somewhere. It is no longer law moving from some radiant center. It is no longer a spiritual sun shining in a celestial firmament. It is beyond all of these things. And we conceive of it as boundless, definitionless, limitless, and all-pervading, all-diffusing allness, deficient in nothing conceivable to creatures. This in itself then becomes, to a strange way, or in a strange way, a vast ocean, an incredible space sea. In the Old Testament, in the old Jewish writings, in Genesis, it is said that the waters which were above the firmament were divided from the waters which are beneath the firmament. And the waters above the firmament were called in the old rabbinical law the Shemayim. And this was the infinite, all-permeating sea of light. It was everything. It was the infinite spirit matter, the infinite space-time, the infinite life substance, the infinite consciousness intellect. And yet infinite, boundless, and thereby by definitionless. For that which is not with definition of form or kind cannot be defined by thought or word. It is therefore an all-permeating, all-pervading totality of life. Now what could we say concerning the mood of this? How is it to be experienced? Totally experienced, we probably do not know. Because even the greatest mystic, even the greatest saint and sage in his samadhi or in his trance, the greatest mystic in his apatheistic ecstasy, cannot be said with certainty to have experienced the totality of it. He has come so close to something that he has been overwhelmed by it. But he cannot be said to have permeated to its core or to its infinite completeness. He has touched it, and already he is consumed. He has never known, as far as we can conceive,
the totality of this thing. Because with the equipment and the power that we have, even the breath of it is almost more than we can conceive. Yet this totality, this infinite and complete unity of all objectivity and subjectivity, of all content and capacity, this thing which Bernie calls bis and abyss, nothing and all, time and eternity, this tremendousness of reality must also be conceived as this complete all-fullness of the thing which we term consciousness. But here again we are using a very definite term wrongly, because it is a diffusion of eternal reality rather than an awareness of something. And this diffusion of eternal self-knowing reality has been represented by an incredible symbolic deity, forever in a state of meditation upon itself, and forever releasing creation internally through an experience of will and yoga. Something whereby which existence comes into being within it by its will, by its own nature, and it remains forever in meditation. And its meditation is creation. And existence is a mood of this eternal existence itself. And theoretically, in the old sacred books, we are told that if the meditating being arouses itself, then creation is dissipated, because it exists only as the dream within the eternity of the eternal dreamer. It is something that is a little too elusive for us, especially in the West. It gets to be too subjective for us to be able to follow it adequately. Now, there's one more quality of this that was mentioned, however, and that is, to use a phrase used by Gabriel Watts, this being is indeed the all-pervading. It is something which is neither here nor there, but is everywhere, always. It is no further from the individual than himself. It is within him, around him. And so he likes to think when he says, I am here and I am surrounded by these qualities, or I am permeated by them. The sea rises and falls in relation to me, flowing through me. Actually, this is not quite the correct perspective. What really happens is that this is forever there and here. And it is this in which we live and move and have our existence. And it is the reality and we are the dream. There was an old Chinese book I found at one time that pointed out that when the gods created man, they gouged holes in space, and that these holes have been walking around ever since. Man is the vacuum, and space is the infinite fullness. And man is the vacuum because he has closed his consciousness to the light of which he is a part. He has shut out the infinite, and therefore is a hole in it. But while this might be crude also, there is a philosophic point here for the thoughtful. Thus, actually and factually, time and infinity occupy the same place at the same time. Man and the infinite are in eternal identification with each other as far as displacement is concerned. That which separates the finite from the infinite is not distance, but qualitative interval. And this is a kind of a fourth, fifth, or sixth dimension, really, so if you wish to so define it. This interval is actually an interval within man, an interval of isolation created by his own concept of existence. In Eastern thinking, not only by one life, but by many lives, and by the constant impact of phenomena, man falls under an hypnosis, a spell, a glamour. And that spell, or hypnosis, or glamour, relates to the illusion of selfhood. To man, the important thing is himself. To the universe, the important thing is the universe. The universe, the tremendous spiritual universe, is the reality, not man. And the human being, gradually unfolding and growing, comes ultimately to the realization that the reality in himself is not a unit, but is the presence of a universal reality. That this universal reality, in its own substance, has never been divided. Therefore, that men may be many outwardly, and many mentally, many emotionally, many egoistically, but in their root and substance they are one. And they are not only one with their own kind, but one with every kind and one with space. That if we can, theoretically, penetrate deeply enough into the person, we move backward through personality to individuality to universality. Thus, that as our objectivity reveals us as many, our subjectivity leads us ultimately, inevitably, to the fact of unity. That this unity is not the ability of the individual to understand his friend alone. This unity is the individual's inevitable participation in the state of allness. Now, this state of allness transcends selfness, oneness as we think of it, because we now come upon a Pythagorean problem, which is interesting for us for just a moment, and that is the consideration of the concept of one. Now, Pythagoras said there is a one which is the archetype of the first. There is the monad, or complete unity, which is the archetype of the all. So one may be first, or it may be all. One is unity, which is the ultimate recognition of the wholeness of things apparently divided. So one may be the all or the first. And when the one stands by itself, it can also be I, which is selfhood. But as Pythagoras defined it, God as one is not only the first, but the all. So totality is unity. And this unity Pythagoras called the monad, because it is one. So that the individual has the experience of oneness, not only as identity, but as unity. Not only the first, but the all. Not only the sum of parts, but the totality, which is a concept superior to the sum of parts. Here, then, as we get back again to the East Indian concept of the thing, we have the individual whose actual existence is that he is rooted in totality. He is not part of it. He's not a little piece of it. He's not the northeast corner of it. And as he moves in toward it, he does not move into a totality. He moves into totality itself. He does not become one with something. He becomes the totality of that thing. The individual, therefore, as he approaches totality, must ascend gradually through division. And he must transcend the concept that these units which he has termed himself are parts of a totality. Because the totality itself is not partial. It is as though you took a black curtain and you made many small pinholes in it and put one light behind. On the other side, each light would be a separate light. And the philosopher might say, yes, but they are all rays of one light. That would be good. But there is something beyond that. We can simply leave out the rays part. They are the one light. They are not its extensions. They are not its manifestations. They are not its conditions. They are not little pieces of it. They are it. So, the central sense of I-ness in man is simply a little hole punched in the infinite, in this darkness. And what he sees, he calls himself. But actually, it is not a fragment of a greater self. It is not a part of it. It is not an individual spark from the eternal flame. That is a good figure of speech, but you have to understand it, or that will lead to a mistake. It is a very poetic statement if understood correctly. Because this totality, it doesn't even cast off sparks. It is always all present, everywhere, forever. And the reason why it appears to have separateness is because on the objective plane, the vehicles of its manifestation have what appears to be a separate existence, without the realization that they exist because of this complete unity, and that their life belongs to it. So gradually we come to the concept that in the totality of things there is one body, creation. And whether it's the ant, or the man, or the planet, or the star, there is one body. And what we call body appears to be a number of forms because we can move in around the parts of them, but the totality of form is a unit in itself. There is one mind. This mind is broken up, apparently, through the phenomena of human mind-brain association, so that we seem to all have separate minds. There is one emotion, but we all seem to have separate feelings. But these feelings are the conditionings by matter and ignorance of one emotion. We have one consciousness, but because of the differences in the vessels into which consciousness flows, we apparently have different kinds of consciousness. The Zen Buddhists have a way of explaining that is rather nice. They use the concept of a great stream of water to represent this infinite consciousness. So a man takes a round vessel and fills it with this water, and he holds it in his hand and says, "Behold, the water is round." Another man comes with a square vessel, fills it, says, "No, water is square." And another man comes with a long, thin pipe and fills that. And he says, "No, water is a long, thin pipe." In other words, the concept is that this universal reality appears to take the likeness of the forms which hold it. And wherever the diversity of forms appears, we are inclined to assume that these forms define the proportions, dimensions, and attributes of this principle, when actually they do not. The motion of this principle causes it, therefore, to be susceptible of being described as an insect, as a bird, as a blade of grass. But none of these descriptions define that principle itself. And in each kingdom of life, in each way of life, there are symbols which are apparently the manifestos of life. But the life itself is one. The root is one. The inevitable energy is one. And this energy, differentiating on levels of consciousness, intelligence, force, represents first unities of these things within its own sovereignty. Being is all. The totality of consciousness is a manifestation of being. The totality of intelligence, or mind, intellect, is a manifestation of being. The totality of force is a manifestation of being. Consciousness, intelligence, and force are a triune aspect of being, at the base of an infinite diversity of trinities and triads and the Trinitarian doctrines of all kinds. But these three themselves, consciousness, intelligence, and force, are again merely appearances, forms, modifications of that which is all of them and is itself also totality, continuum. So in its pure totality, being is the absolute, indivisible completeness, deficient in nothing, that is required or possible in an infinite manifestation of its own nature. Man, going into himself, therefore, has to move inevitably as an experience of consciousness backward or inward toward source. This is his only home. The only way home is back into source. If he continues to go out objectively into phenomena, he can go out to the furthest reaches of space, but he will still be imprisoned, because he can never escape by extending himself on a level. And on the level of matter, he can go to the end of time, but he will never escape matter. Therefore, he will never find reality. He must recognize that the latter faculties and powers which he has within himself must be climbed by himself toward his own source. And that the only way out of ignorance is toward reality. And the only place that reality is accessible to the individual immediately is through the release of his own internals, his own internal powers. Here is his immediate participation in the infinite. Through discipline, therefore, he is taught to overcome one by one the negatives, by means of which he is held to a state of Maya or illusion. He is taught to discriminate values, first on very simple levels. He is taught to choose more wisely his interests and activities. He is instructed in penetrating by degrees the illusion of phenomena, which is the illusion of separateness. He is taught that every time that he discovers a common ground, we have made a symbolical approach to truth. That wherever he overcomes a prejudice, he has stated a reality. Wherever he has removed conflict between himself and another person, he has stated a reality. Wherever he has synthesized diversified knowledge within his own nature, has found common denominators for ideas and opinions variously held. Wherever he has found a link between his own profession and the work of another man, wherever he has found a common ground between the contentions of one creed and the pretensions of another, wherever he has gradually gained the skills to experience unities, where previously he beheld only diversities. To this degree, he begins a gradual series of affirmations by action, statements by conduct, moved by conviction, toward realities. Wherever, for any reason, he divides things now united, he is adding to the illusion. So knowledge has as its primary purpose in him, its daily purpose, the overcoming of ignorance. And the overcoming of ignorance is essentially the overcoming of diversity. Diversity, the recognition of the so-called reality of divided parts, is ignorance. Ignorance is based upon the inability to bridge. The ignorant man lacks bridges between himself and life, between himself and others, between himself and the pervading opinions, knowledge, doctrines, ideas, beliefs of his time. He therefore improves himself in order that he may understand. And understanding is again an experience of unity, often through sympathy. Understanding, knowledge, then, has as its internal primary, its great purpose, this demonstration of identities, the proving through experience of sovereign realities larger than parts, and solving any problem of parts by discovering the superior unity which controls them. A man studies an art or science. He cannot proceed long before he realizes that the arts and sciences are part of one thing. He studies science, then he studies philosophy, then he studies religion. But ultimately he learns that these are three names for one essential principle. As knowledge increases, he discovers the identities of these three and their integrity as elements of a unit or of a larger design. So he discovers that above religion, science, and philosophy is the over-concept of truth itself. That they are dimensions or extensions of the idea of truth on a level of illusional or imperfect mind. So his search for knowledge is always rewarded by the experience of unity. Now, on the emotional level, the experience of unity can produce the phenomenon of love. Because love arises from the recognition of values, from an experience toward decentralization of self. There can be no real love unless there is a bridging between self-purpose and service to another creature. Therefore, love is the giving of self to another. It is a departure from self. It is an escape from isolation, which is a term for selfhood. Love, therefore, is the recognition of the good in another. It is the service of that good in another. It is the dedication of personal energy, power, to an impersonal or non-personal objective, the service of another. Therefore, it helps to break down egocentricity. If it is possessive, it tries to draw the object of its affection, and in so doing instantly ceases to be loved. Because love cannot possess. Where there is possession, there is passion, but there cannot be love. So love becomes again a unifying power. We say, love your neighbor, love your enemy. To love must come with understanding. And understanding is breaking down false barriers which have been built between identities, things substantially indivisible, artificially divided by the ignorance in man himself. So everything that tends toward the recognition of unity is an advancement of learning. So we go gradually against the stream. For remember, in the Western world, we have made the great pattern of specialization by breaking up unity. We are paying for that in our psychology of life. We are paying for the glorification of fragments by gradually becoming more and more fragmentary as a civilization and less able to unite, cooperate, or work together for any common objective. We are producing people who think only of their own advantage. That is the end of social unity. And when society ceases to be a wholeness, it dies. For society is a unity and an experiencing unity. And society depends for its survival upon the good of the whole being elevated above the rights of the individual, yet under a lawful and proper order. Man approaching the mysteries of consciousness must also think in terms of the good of the whole, unity, above the advantage of the divided parts. So he proceeds, and knowledge continues to increase in him as an experience of identities. For this is essential knowledge. It's nice to learn to speak Greek. It's very pleasant to learn to square the circle or trisect the angle. But essential knowledge is the constant pushing toward the recognition of unity. That is essential knowledge. On any and all levels, it causes the individual to ascend to the experience of a totality of some kind. And every totality is a miniature of the universal one. Every totality is a symbol of infinite unity. So that which lives in the approach to totality is living perpetually in a state of worship. Whereas that which lives in a sense of fragmentation is living perpetually in a state of blasphemy, in the discrediting of the divine power, the perverting of its agencies, the misuse of its principles. Knowledge, then, is always moving toward this unity. Not on an intellectual level, but gradually on an experiential level. The individual is learning to become aware of unity. Is becoming, therefore, aware of something which has an existence. And he is also becoming aware of something which, as his awareness increases, he realizes to be greater than himself. Now, the individual does not hesitate, usually, to acknowledge the existence of a power superior to himself. But he lives as though it did not exist. He lives as though any power superior to himself was little better than an interference. Actually, the gradual experience of unity causes man, by degrees, to become aware of the sovereign unity, and to see in each of the united patterns like a magnificent crystal or a snowflake, which is a perfectly orderly unity, the dynamic symbols of infinite unity. That each unit, each thing which is a completeness in itself, is a seal, as Bailey called it, the signaturum rerum, the great, real, positive seal of the infinite. And that reality stamps itself upon all wholeness, and that all wholeness participates in its experience. And that therefore man, to experience, as far as he can, absolute unity, must achieve this experience through the totality of himself. Now, the totality of himself can imply several things. But essentially, it implies the gradual unfoldment of his own potentials, so that there is no longer any deficit or deficiency in his parts by which fragmentation is perpetuated. For where there is something that is strong and something else that is weak, there cannot be unity. So that if man has many faculties, uses half of them, and does not use the other half, he cannot have the experience of totality. Totality is the experience of its own nature. And when the individual, through the extension of his knowledge, through the gradual ascent of his consciousness, gradually eliminates the error from the compound, he finally arrives at the summit of his own potential. And in ascending that summit and reaching that summit, which is also the end of knowledge, he finds that the only thing that remains now as an illusion is himself as the observer of all other things. That between him and the infinite, there remains only his own determination to see or examine the infinite and to know it. And that as long as this interval remains, he is not in a state of identity. Therefore, the yogas lead to the gradual diminution of this sense of the subject-object. And the individual, having achieved gradually nearer and nearer to unity, discovers on a vast scale that which he experiences first on a simple and human scale. We say in daily living that the happy man is the one who forgets himself. That is also true of the great achievement of yoga. The sublime man, the illumined man, the individual capable of the infinite experience of illumination and identification, is the person who has forgotten himself. And in having forgotten himself, has become susceptible of or capable of the infinite experience of being. So as self-forgetfulness turns us from our small sorrows to more useful living, so the supreme act of self-forgetfulness makes available to man the complete re-identification of himself with undivided being. Now, the individual says, I dive into the ocean and I am lost. We do not know that that is so. We know, however, that the individual approaches an undefinable state of absolute transcendency. That he finds all attributes as he knew them, ceases. But with this also comes an incredible sense of infinite security. It comes a complete and total acceptance of totality. And something that we cannot understand until through growth and experience we have come nearer to it. And that is that the individual who gives up himself for reality has given up nothing. Because he had nothing to give up in the first place, when he had a long time trying to do it. And that therefore, at the end, instead of being a little self absorbed in the sea, he is actually the dreamer who has awakened. The only trouble is, he has no concept of what that waking state is. The only thing that he can conceive of is that he has passed from a state of seeming to a state of being. And because everything that he knows and thinks about has been part of a dream, he is afraid to awake. And because he has no concept of what lies beyond, he considers that waking is annihilation. But there is no evidence that such is the case. For waking is total experience of consciousness. And the individual who joins this consciousness and becomes aware of and immediately diffused in totality arrives not at unconsciousness but all consciousness. And in all consciousness, the individual becomes not a God, but God. Therefore, becomes identical with the infinite life, wisdom, love, law. And as this moves all things and is the root of all consciousness, it cannot be said to be oblivion. It is a transcendent state for which man has no available definition. But it can only arise as gradually the illusion dies through the disciplines of knowledge. And through knowledge, man comes finally to know that which is desirable. And in achieving this end, he gathers the resources of his nature for the final decision to awaken. And this final decision brings him into something not knowable by knowledge, but which he could not attain without the experience of knowledge to lead him, guide him, direct him, and in various ways protect him from the illusions and the compounding illusions which come in man's questing. So this, in substance, is all we can do tonight, for the time is up. And we'll have to save the further consideration of this and other problems for a discussion on logic later.